On the night of October the 12th, 1307, one of the most powerful men in Christendom sat down to dinner in Paris, having no idea that sealed arrest warrants bearing his name were already in the hands of every royal bailiff in France. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, had just attended the funeral of a princess of the royal house. He had carried the coffin alongside kings. He believed he was untouchable, but at that very moment, thousands of parchment envelopes stamped with the king's seal sat unopened in locked rooms across the kingdom, each one containing the same chilling instruction: arrest every Templar you can find at dawn on Friday, October the 13th. Do not warn them, do not negotiate. Seize everything, and yet somehow somebody talked. Because while Jacques de Molay slept, something extraordinary was already happening in the dark streets of Paris and along the muddy roads leading west toward the Atlantic. Treasury vaults that should have been full were being emptied. Iron-bound chests stuffed with gold, silver, jewels, and documents, the accumulated wealth and secrets of nearly 2 centuries, were being loaded onto wagons under cover of night. A knight named Gerard de Villiers reportedly gathered 50 mounted men and a mysterious cargo and rode hard for the coast. Their destination was La Rochelle, the Templar port on the Atlantic seaboard, where a fleet of merchant galleys sat at anchor, crewed and ready. By the time royal soldiers smashed through the doors of the Paris Temple at dawn on Friday the 13th, the vaults were bare, the treasury of the order had vanished, and 18 ships had already slipped their moorings and disappeared into the open Atlantic. They were never officially seen again. So what happened to those ships? Where did they go? And what were they carrying that was so important that 700 years of silence, erasure, and institutional secrecy have failed to provide a definitive answer? To understand the scale of what vanished that night, you have to understand what the Templars had become by 1307. They were not simply monks who carried swords. They had evolved into the most extraordinary institution medieval Europe had ever produced. Founded in 1119 in Jerusalem by a small band of knights sworn to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, the order had grown into an international powerhouse with over 800 properties across Christendom, from Scotland to Cyprus, from Portugal to the Baltic. They had invented the first international banking system. A pilgrim could deposit money in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem using coded receipts. Kings borrowed from them. Nobles entrusted their entire estates to Templar stewardship. They answered to no earthly authority except the Pope himself. Their white mantles blazoned with red crosses were recognized and feared on every battlefield from Acre to Antioch. But that very power had made them vulnerable. Success breeds resentment, and by the early 14th century, one man resented them more than anyone: Philip IV of France. Philip was desperate. His wars had drained the royal treasury. He owed the Templars enormous sums he could never repay. He had already expelled the Jews from France in 1306 and seized their assets. He had debased the currency so badly it triggered riots. And now he looked at the Templar network, its lands, its gold, its unaccountable independence, and he saw his solution. All he needed was a pretext. The charges Philip manufactured were sensational, almost absurdly so. Templar initiates, it was alleged, were forced to deny Christ 3 times and spit on the cross. They were accused of worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, a bearded head that supposedly granted them occult power. Obscene rituals were described in lurid detail, and beneath it all lurked darker whispers that the Templars possessed forbidden knowledge, documents excavated from beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem during their earliest years, materials that could shake the foundations of the church itself. Under torture, confessions were extracted, bones were broken, flesh was burned. Men who had fought Saracens across the deserts of the Holy Land were reduced to saying whatever their inquisitors demanded. On November the 22nd, 1307, Pope Clement V, himself under Philip's political control, issued the papal bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, ordering every Christian monarch in Europe to arrest the Templars in their territories and seize their property. But the response across Europe was far from uniform. In Aragon, the king refused to use torture and found no evidence of heresy. In Portugal, the Templars were declared completely innocent and simply reorganized under a new name, the Order of Christ. In England, Edward II dragged his feet, conducting slow, half-hearted arrests that let many Templars simply walk away. And then there was Scotland. The papal bull arrived in a kingdom that was, at that precise moment, excommunicated. And this is where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. Scotland in 1307 was a kingdom in chaos, ruled, barely, by a man who had nothing left to lose. Robert the Bruce had murdered his rival John Comyn in a church in February of 1306. He had stabbed a man before the altar. For this, the Pope had excommunicated him personally. Bruce was crowned King of Scots anyway, but without papal recognition, his claim was considered illegitimate by every major power in Europe. His wife and daughter were imprisoned by the English. 3 of his brothers had been captured and executed. English armies were hunting him through the Highlands. He was, by any conventional measure, a beaten man, and into this desperate situation sailed ships carrying trained knights, military engineers, financial experts, and possibly the greatest treasure in medieval history. Think about this from Bruce's perspective. He was already excommunicated. The Pope's orders meant nothing to him. He desperately needed experienced soldiers, men who understood fortification, logistics, cavalry tactics, siege warfare. And here they were, arriving on his western coast, men who had nowhere else to go and everything to offer. The Templars needed a king who would defy Rome. Bruce needed an army that could defeat England. It was a marriage of mutual desperation. And the transformation that followed is one of the most dramatic reversals in medieval history. Between 1307 and 1314, Robert the Bruce went from a fugitive hiding in caves to the victor of Bannockburn, one of the most decisive battles ever fought on British soil. At Bannockburn, a vastly outnumbered Scottish force destroyed a massive English army. Contemporary observers found the outcome almost impossible to explain. The tactical sophistication displayed, particularly the use of schiltron formations, dense squares of spearmen that broke repeated English cavalry charges, was unusual for Scottish warfare of the period. But it was not unusual for men who had spent generations fighting mounted warriors in the Crusader states. The sudden appearance of these advanced tactics in Scotland coincides precisely with the window in which Templar refugees would have arrived and been integrated into Bruce's forces. Coincidence is possible, but it is a remarkably convenient one. The physical evidence is harder to dismiss. In 1956, archaeologists working in Kilmartin Glen in Argyll, on Scotland's remote western coast, catalogued nearly 80 medieval grave slabs that had been moved into the burial aisle of the local church. The earliest stones date to approximately 1300, the exact period of the Templar escape. They are carved with swords, beautifully detailed weapon outlines showing specific blade types and hilts. But they carry no names, no heraldic devices, no family crests, no lineage whatsoever. In medieval Scotland, where even minor landowners insisted on being identified on their grave markers, this level of deliberate anonymity is extraordinary. These were not peasants. The sword carvings indicate men of military rank and status. Yet someone went to great lengths to ensure they could never be identified. The pattern matches authenticated Templar burial sites across Europe, where the same austerity and anonymity are hallmarks of the Order's funerary traditions. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed additional unmarked graves beneath the surface. Carbon dating confirms burials from the early 1300s through the 1400s. Weapon fragments have been recovered, and yet these burials appear in absolutely no documentary record whatsoever. They are ghosts in the ground. Kilmartin is not alone. At Ballintrodoch in Midlothian, renamed simply Temple after centuries of Templar occupation, carved stones match those found at French Templar commanderies. At Merry Coulter in Aberdeenshire, a documented Templar property, building foundations have been dated to 1310 through 1350, the post-dissolution period when the site should have been empty. The geographic distribution of these sites reveals a pattern. They cluster along defensive positions, invasion routes, and near royal strongholds. The western coast, Argyll, the Hebrides, would have been the natural landfall for ships arriving from the Atlantic. The placement suggests not random settlement, but deliberate military integration into Scotland's defensive infrastructure. But perhaps the most compelling evidence is what is missing. Across multiple Scottish archives, the Exchequer rolls, bishops' registers, monastic cartularies, parish records, there are gaps so consistent and so precisely targeted that they cannot be explained by accident, fire, or natural decay. Exchequer rolls are missing entire years of entries between 1307 and 1320. Bishops' registers show pages that have been physically cut out with blades. Monastic records have been scraped clean with pumice stone and overwritten in different ink. Dates have been modified. Marginal notes survive only where censors apparently overlooked them. Properties that were generating income before and after this gap period produce no recorded revenue during the critical years. The same properties are confirmed operational in later documents. This is not random loss. This is coordinated, systematic, institutional erasure affecting multiple archives simultaneously. Someone went through the records of an entire kingdom and removed every trace of what happened between roughly 1307 and 1320. The question is not whether evidence was destroyed. The question is what was being hidden. The testimony of Jean de Chalon, a French Templar, provides the only direct reference to the fleet. He stated under interrogation that 18 galleys departed La Rochelle, carrying the treasury of the order. Maritime historians have questioned whether the Templars actually possessed 18 galleys. Their fleet was primarily merchant shipping, not a war navy. No harbour records document any Scottish arrival. But Jean de Chalon's testimony, even if it was hearsay rather than eyewitness, aligns with the physical reality that the Templar treasury vanished completely and was never recovered by Philip's agents. Statistical modelling conducted by researchers in the 1990s and 2000s identified at least 335 Templars who are completely unaccounted for after the French arrests. No trial records, no pension records, no transfer documentation, no death certificates. 335 men who simply ceased to exist in the documentary record. When researchers applied process of elimination analysis, ruling out the Iberian kingdoms where Templars were already accounted for, the Germanic territories that were too fragmented and politically unreliable, and England where the crown was too closely tied to French politics, Scotland emerged as the single most probable destination for a significant number of these missing men. Advanced imaging techniques applied to the Kilmartin stones in recent years have revealed something even more startling. Reflectance transformation imaging, a technology that can read text invisible to the naked eye, uncovered partially erased Latin inscriptions on several stones. The formulas match Templar liturgical texts. The damage to these inscriptions was deliberate, not the result of weathering. Sword details carved into the stones match weapon types listed in Templar inventory records. Someone carved these markers with care and precision. Then someone else came along and tried to erase the words while leaving the images. The stones were meant to honor the dead. The erasure was meant to hide who the dead actually were. The architectural evidence tells a similar story. At sites across Scotland that were supposedly dissolved and emptied after 1312, there is clear evidence of new construction, fortifications, expanded chapels, residential quarters built in a military religious style that matches Templar commanderies in the Holy Land. Rosslyn Chapel, begun in 1446 by William Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, whose family had documented Templar connections, is perhaps the most famous example of how deeply Templar symbolism embedded itself in Scottish culture. By the mid-15th century, Templar heritage had become something worth claiming rather than concealing. The elaborate carvings at Rochelle incorporate Templar-linked symbols alongside imagery that scholars have debated for centuries. Place names across Scotland preserve the memory even more directly. Sites continue to be called the Temple in local records for centuries after the Order's official dissolution, even when they had been nominally transferred to the Hospitallers. And then there is the question that haunts every investigation into this story. What about the treasure? If ships did reach Scotland carrying the accumulated wealth and archives of the Order, none of it has ever been found. Rochelle Chapel has been extensively searched. Former Templar properties have been excavated. No caches have been discovered. Either the treasure never existed in the form described, or it was dispersed so thoroughly across so many hands that it lost its identity, or, and this is the possibility that keeps researchers awake at night, it remains hidden somewhere, undiscovered after 7 centuries. The archives may matter more than the gold. The Templars spent 9 years excavating beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem during the Order's earliest days. In 1867, British archaeological surveys confirmed the existence of tunnels beneath the mount containing artifacts bearing Templar marks. The Order rose from abject poverty to staggering wealth and influence almost immediately after those excavations concluded. What did they find down there? Accusations at the trials referenced documents proving alternative Christian origins, bloodlines that challenged the authority of both church and crown, materials deemed harmful to the faith. Were these fantasies invented under torture, or were they distorted reflections of something real? The connection between the Templars and Scottish Freemasonry, which emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries, adds another layer to the mystery. Freemasonry claims descent from medieval stonemasons, but it incorporates extensive Templar mythology, similar hierarchical degree structures, secret initiation rituals, and architectural metaphors centered on temple symbolism. Several of the oldest Scottish lodges explicitly claimed Templar descent. The transmission pathway, from a suppressed military religious order through monastic networks, craft guilds, and stoneworkers' organizations that controlled specialized architectural knowledge, is plausible even if it cannot be conclusively proven. Knowledge that was too dangerous to record openly could survive encoded in ritual, symbol, and oral tradition, passed from master to apprentice across generations, waiting for conditions that would permit its reconstruction. Modern institutional resistance to definitive research remains a real obstacle. Excavation permissions at key Scottish sites have been delayed or restricted. Heritage officials cite the need to protect fragile structures, but researchers have questioned whether it is structures or established historical interpretations that are being protected. The Vatican's own position is revealing. In 2007, the Chinon parchment was published, proving that Pope Clement V had privately absolved the Templar leadership of heresy before dissolving the order under political pressure from Philip. The Church officially maintains that the dissolution in 1312 was final. Vatican archives covering the 14th and 15th centuries remain partially restricted, accessible only through special permissions granted on a case-by-case basis. 7 centuries after 18 ships may or may not have carried the last Templars to Scotland's western shore, the full truth remains elusive. The grave slabs at Kilmartin stand as silent witnesses, anonymous warriors whose swords were carved in stone, but whose names were scraped from history. The gaps in the archives speak as loudly as any document. The tactical revolution that carried Robert the Bruce from fugitive to king demands an explanation that conventional history has never fully provided. The Templars were officially destroyed. Their order was dissolved. Their leaders were burned at the stake, but knowledge once distributed cannot be fully destroyed. It survives in fragments, in architecture, in ritual, in symbols carved on forgotten stones in remote Scottish glens. The real conspiracy was never that the Templars were heretics. It was that they represented an alternative source of knowledge and authority that neither church nor crown could tolerate. Some of them escaped. They carried their archives and their traditions into a kingdom beyond Rome's reach. And the 7 centuries of silence that followed tell you everything you need to know about how dangerous that knowledge was considered to be. The stones remember, even when the records do not.